Today's reading from the Gospel of Matthew reminds me of something important in the Jesus story. In general, the Gospels have a lot of movement in them. Jesus appears on the scene suddenly as an adult. He's on the move with no place to lay his head. He's teaching and healing, traveling through Galilee or across the Sea of Galilee or into Samaria and finally to Jerusalem, where he is arrested, executed, and dramatically resurrected again. From start to finish, the story has a lot of forward movement and power. So that makes it especially striking and important, I think, to notice that there are also these occasional pauses, these moments when Jesus steps out of the flow of forward movement and into a different space, apart, to pray and recollect himself. And you see it in today's text. Now, when Jesus heard that his friend John the Baptizer had been arrested, it said, he withdrew. He withdrew to Galilee. John was baptizing people just north and east of Jerusalem, we think, so it's likely that Jesus had been in that area too. But after John is arrested by Herod Antipas, a client king of Rome, Jesus heads north to Galilee, kind of out of the way, away from the big city, passing up even on Nazareth to make his home, the text says, in the village of Capernaum by the sea. So when things got rough, Jesus moved to the beach. And I totally get that. I'm being a little facetious, but there are two things to note here. One is that Jesus' life was not easy. He lived in difficult, threatening times. His people were an oppressed minority in the Roman Empire, and anyone who said or did anything about it was at serious risk. Yet, Jesus felt called to say and do something in that context. The second thing to note, however, is that he also took time to withdraw, to step away, to pray, to seek God and be renewed in spirit. When things got rough, Jesus went to the beach, the hills, the mountains, the beautiful garden. And I do totally get that. When I get that thinned out feeling or unsettled in spirit, I go for a walk in the mountains. That's the only thing that'll cure me. Or at least to some place where I can sit and stare at the mountains off in the distance. And there have been lots of times in my life when walking by the sea was the best possible therapy. And that's where we find Jesus in today's text, walking by the Sea of Galilee, it says, walking by the sea when he saw Peter and Andrew casting a net into the sea. And he said to them, "Follow me." And the image of Jesus walking by the sea is comforting to me. If he needed to spend time by the sea, in the hills, in the garden, how much more do I? Soon, however, his time of withdrawal ends, and we find him traveling throughout Galilee, healing, teaching, and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. Change, he says, change, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. It makes me wonder, it appears to me that the energy of his ministry, the forward movement, flowed from these times and places apart. And this pattern shows up repeatedly in the Gospels. In Matthew, right after his baptism, Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he fasted 40 days and 40 nights. Later in Matthew, after the execution of John, we read, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself." Different translations use different words here. Jesus withdrew to a deserted place, a place apart, a quiet place, a desert place, a remote place, to be alone, a lonely place, even a desolate place. Then when the crowds heard it, the Bible says, they followed him on foot. He went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. Here's another one. After the feeding of the 5,000, immediately it says he made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side, and after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Afterward again, we find him healing all that were brought to him. And finally, there's the familiar story from the end of his life. After the Last Supper, we are told, Jesus went with his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane and said to them, "Sit here while I go forward, while I go over there and pray." By himself again, alone. And afterward, as he is arrested, he refuses to resist. heals a servant wounded by a disciple, and orders a sword to be put away. So could it be that these times apart, alone, in a quiet place, to pray and meditate, were essential to Jesus' ability to have compassion for the crowds, heal the hurting, and refuse the temptation of violence? I think so. I think so. And if he needed to spend time by the sea, in the hills, in the garden, how much more do I? How much more do we? For the last 2 weeks, I've talked about our need to embrace the good news of the gospel, which proclaims that we can be transformed, and we can become agents of transformation in society, too. The willingness to go to a place apart, to create space in our lives for spirit, is another crucial part of experiencing transformation for ourselves and society. Maybe even the crucial part. In his book, Peace is Every Step, the Buddhist monk and peacemaker Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "The roots of war are in the way we live our daily lives, the way we develop our industries, build up our society, and consume goods. We have to look deeply into the situation, and we will see the roots of war. We can't just blame one side or the other. We have to transcend the tendency to take sides. Anger," he said, "is like a blazing flame that burns up our self-control and causes us to say and do things we regret later. When someone is angry, we can see clearly that he or she is abiding in hell. Anger and hatred are the materials from which hell is made. A mind without anger is cool, fresh, and sane." The absence of anger is the basis of real happiness, the basis of love and compassion. And he continues, "When our anger is placed under the lamp of mindfulness, it immediately begins to lose some of its destructive nature. If we follow our breathing closely while we identify and mindfully observe our anger, it can no longer monopolize our consciousness." And I did not put Violet up to doing that, by the way. That was the spirit moving. Violet being Violet, but it worked. So, in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, verse 6, Jesus talks about prayer. He also talks about anger in the Sermon on the Mount. And the point isn't, I think, Jesus got angry in the Gospels. There are places Jesus gets angry. But the point that Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about, I think, and that Jesus is talking about, is anger that consumes us and causes us to lose our mind, essentially, and hate others without really self-examining what's going on with us. But in Matthew 6, verse 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about prayer and says, "Whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door. And pray to the one who is in secret, and the one who sees in secret will reward you." And Father Thomas Keating saw in this teaching the model for centering prayer that he taught. And in his book, Open Mind, Open Heart, he said, "Notice in this instruction from Jesus the cascading movement of the text into ever deeper states of silence, leaving behind external tumult, entering our inner room, the spiritual level of our being, closing the door, shutting out, turning away from the interior conversation we normally have with ourselves all day long as we judge, evaluate, and react to people and events. Praying in secret to God who speaks to us beyond the sound of our words. This kind of prayer," Keating says, "leads to a process of interior transformation. One's way of seeing reality changes in this process. A restructuring of consciousness takes place, which allows one to perceive, relate, and respond to everyday life with increasing sensitivity to God's presence." You see, the willingness to go to a place apart, to create space in our lives for spirit, is crucial to experiencing transformation for ourselves and for society. And it's interesting, in our action-oriented society, and to some extent in our action-oriented church and denomination, everyone remembers things like the remarkable power of the 1963 Birmingham Civil Rights Campaign, in which people confronted the violent racism embodied by bull Connor, fire hoses, police billy clubs, and angry mobs with nonviolence. Those images are still with us today, still powerful. And everyone remembers that those images and actions led almost directly to the March on Washington later in 1963 and the Civil Rights legislation of 1964. But we tend to forget the deeply spiritual roots on which the courageous nonviolence of that campaign was based. Martin Luther King insisted that everyone who took part in the Birmingham campaign make a pledge of nonviolence, which had been written by James Lawson, and it went like this. As you prepare to march, meditate on the life and teachings of Jesus. Remember the nonviolent movement. Remember the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. That one really struck me because often, even in our social justice efforts locally, I am obsessed with victory. And Lawson is saying, and the movement is saying, there's a more important thing happening here, even than the winning of this issue, or there's another transformation happening. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Pray daily to be used by God, that all men and women might be free. Give up personal wishes, so that all might be free. Observe with friend and foes the ordinary rules of courtesy. And remember the images from that campaign. You practice courtesy, he's urging those who are going to engage in this, when we know what they're going to encounter is not just lack of courtesy, but hatred and violence. Perform regular service for others in the world. Refrain from violence of fist, tongue, and heart. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health, and follow the directions of the movement leaders. So do you hear the space for spirit in that pledge? Meditate on the life and teachings of Jesus. Pray daily. Refrain from violence of heart. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. You know, many of you work or have worked in nonprofit efforts for social change, and those are exhausting places to work sometimes. That is hard work because you're up against some of the most difficult issues and challenging situations in society. So this idea of what does it mean to stay spiritually and bodily healthy, to find these places of power. Before the transformation of the civil disobedience campaign could take place in society, there was a transformation of spirit. That's what we're seeing here. In his blog, peace activist and author John Deere wrote, "This beautiful pledge of nonviolence offers guideposts for us in our pursuit of the abolition of war, poverty, the death penalty, racism, sexism, corporate greed, catastrophic climate change, and nuclear weapons." And he summarizes it: meditate, remember, walk, pray, sacrifice, observe, seek, refrain, strive, follow. If we live in that spirit, he writes, then we can help build a global movement that can resist our Bull Connor government and transform our Birmingham world. And that was written way back in 2013. So sisters and brothers, this too is good news. For your mind and body, for your heart and soul, for our world. Each day, each week, before you go and do, stay and be. Take the time, as Jesus did, each day, each week, to go to a place apart, to the quiet room, the beach, the mountains, the beautiful garden. Make a space for spirit in your life and be changed.